Somebody actually walked into a job interview, listed their Hogwarts house as a leadership credential, and then got mad when they didn't get the job. And that is just number 12 on this list. If you've ever sat across from someone in an interview and thought, how are you even a functioning adult? This video is about to be your therapy session. Drop a comment with the dumbest thing you've ever heard in an interview. Smash that subscribe button, and let's get into all 49 of these beautiful disasters. 1. A man walked into his interview feeling completely unstoppable that morning. When the interviewer asked why he left his last position, he leaned forward and explained that his former boss was basically a Disney villain, but somehow even less competent. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence that nobody attempted to fill. One interviewer slowly placed her pen on the table and stared at him. He maintained full eye contact the entire time, like he had rehearsed this answer and was proud of it. He left without an offer and genuinely could not figure out why. 2. A young woman confidently slid her resume across the table during what she believed was going well. The interviewer reached the languages section and paused longer than felt normal. Under foreign languages, she had listed fluent sarcasm as though it belonged between Spanish and Mandarin. She then explained it was actually a highly valuable communication skill that modern workplaces were seriously lacking. The hiring manager nodded slowly in that specific way people do when they have already made their decision internally. She never received a callback and later described the company as professionally closed-minded. 3. A woman told her interviewer with complete confidence that she had left her previous job because Mercury was in retrograde and the vibes around the entire office had been genuinely off for months. The interviewer blinked twice and asked her to clarify what that meant professionally. She pulled out her phone to show her astrology app as supporting evidence. The hiring panel exchanged glances that said everything without saying anything at all. She felt the interview went reasonably well and was shocked when nobody followed up with her the following week. 4. An uncle walked into the interview room, and when asked about his greatest productivity skills, he proudly announced that he had mastered the art of strategic napping. He explained it with the confidence of someone presenting a business plan to investors. He described it as a recovery system that maximized his afternoon output significantly. The interviewer genuinely did not know whether to laugh or simply end the meeting early. He had even included it on his resume under special skills, as though it belonged next to project management and data analysis. 5. A man sat before the entire hiring panel, and when asked how he performs under supervision, he smiled and said he works best when absolutely nobody is watching him. Then he winked very slowly at the lead interviewer, as though this was a charming thing to say out loud during a formal job interview. The panel sat quietly for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. He seemed completely relaxed and unbothered. He did not get the job, and the wink was mentioned in the internal feedback notes, apparently. 6. A young man was asked during his interview to describe his biggest professional weakness. He straightened his jacket and explained calmly that he does not actually believe weaknesses exist, and that his so-called flaws are simply features that society has not yet caught up to. The interviewer stared at him, waiting for a follow-up that never came. He sat there looking genuinely satisfied with his answer, as though he had just said something deeply philosophical. The offer never arrived, and he told his friends the company simply was not on his level. 7. A man had boldly listed photographic memory as one of his strongest professional abilities on his resume. The interviewer was impressed and asked him a simple follow-up question about the company. He froze completely. After several seconds of painful silence, he admitted he could not actually remember the name of the company he was currently sitting inside interviewing for. The interviewer slid the resume back across the table without a word. He tried to recover by saying his memory worked better under less pressure, which somehow made the entire situation considerably worse. 8. A woman sat down and immediately brought up the topic of compensation before anything else. She argued confidently that she deserved a significantly higher starting salary than what was listed. When the interviewer asked what experience justified that number, she explained that she had gone viral on Facebook back in 2014 and felt that level of public influence deserved proper financial recognition. And the interviewer typed something into her computer and never looked up again for the remainder of the conversation. The woman left believing she had negotiated well and waited for an offer that simply never came. 9. A young man opened his interview by announcing he was a Sigma and did not personally believe in workplace hierarchies or organizational structures of any kind. He said it with the energy of someone who had practiced this speech in the mirror that morning. The interviewer nodded politely and then asked him a simple, practical question about reporting lines within the team. Without missing a beat, he leaned forward and asked exactly who he would be reporting to on a daily basis. Nobody in the room pointed out what had just happened, and he did not seem to notice either. 10. A man told the interviewer with tremendous enthusiasm that he had personally developed a revolutionary productivity framework which he had named Scheduled Spontaneity. He described it as a carefully structured system built entirely around being unpredictable. The interviewer asked him to explain how that worked in practice inside a real workplace. He paused for a noticeably long time and then said the beauty of it was that even he did not always know what came next. The interviewer wrote something down and circled it twice. The role was filled by someone else within 3 days of that conversation ending. 11. A woman told the panel she is absolutely great under pressure and handles stressful situations better than anyone she has ever worked with. The interviewer nodded and moved forward with the next question. And then she interrupted and asked whether it would be possible to reschedule the interview because sitting in the room was making her feel quite pressured at that moment. The panel stared at her in complete silence. She looked back at them expecting a reasonable response. Nobody rescheduled anything, and the irony of the entire situation appeared completely invisible to her that afternoon. 12. A teenage boy applying for his first professional role handed over his resume with genuine confidence. Under leadership credentials, he had listed his Hogwarts house and written a brief explanation of why it demonstrated strong character. The interviewer read it twice to make sure she was seeing it correctly. He then explained that the sorting hat does not make mistakes, and that his house specifically produced some of history's most determined individuals. The interviewer closed the folder slowly. He went home and told his mom the interviewer probably went to the wrong house and simply could not handle it. 13. A woman sat down and the interviewer asked about her technical skills. She leaned forward and said she was basically fluent in Excel. The interviewer looked genuinely pleased and began asking about pivot tables and data functions. The woman then clarified that her fluency was specifically based on the time she used the sum formula once during a group project in college. The interviewer stopped typing immediately. She had listed Excel as an advanced skill on her resume and saw absolutely nothing misleading about the way she had described her experience to the panel. 14. A man was asked the classic interview question about where he sees himself professionally in 5 years. He smiled slowly and told the interviewer his 5-year plan was to be sitting in her exact chair, doing her exact job. He then added no offense as though that single phrase would soften what he had just said to her face. The interviewer wrote something down without responding. He interpreted her silence as impressed consideration rather than barely contained disbelief. He followed up with an email 3 days later asking if she had given his plan any serious thought. 15. A man told the panel with complete seriousness that he never misses deadlines under any circumstances, and that punctuality is one of his strongest professional values. The interviewer smiled and asked him to walk through his most recent role. He began talking and within 2 minutes casually mentioned that he had been approximately 2 weeks late to each of his last 3 project deadlines. The panel said nothing and waited. He continued speaking without appearing to notice the contradiction he had introduced into the conversation less than 90 seconds after making his original claim. 16. A woman was asked to describe her ideal working environment so the team could assess whether she would be a good fit. She thought about it briefly, and then explained that she performs at her absolute best when working completely alone in total silence with no deadlines of any kind attached to her work. The interviewer looked at the job description sitting on the table between them, which listed teamwork and deadline management as the two primary requirements for the role. Nobody said anything for a moment. She smiled and asked when she could expect to hear back from them. 17. A man was asked how he stays current in his field and what he does for ongoing professional development. He leaned back in his chair and said he was currently between podcasts. The interviewer waited for him to continue. He did not continue. That was the complete answer. She wrote something on her notepad and underlined it. And he seemed entirely satisfied with what he had said and moved on by asking about the office parking situation. The role required continuous learning and industry awareness, and he had described his development plan in 4 words without any visible embarrassment. 18. A woman was asked about her technical proficiency during the interview, and she confidently stated she was fully skilled in PowerPoint. The interviewer asked about her experience creating professional presentations for business purposes. She explained that her most significant PowerPoint project was a detailed birthday slideshow she had made for her dog, which included transitions and a themed color palette. The interviewer closed her laptop halfway. The woman added that the dog had really seemed to enjoy it, which she felt demonstrated strong audience awareness. She did not get the job and could not understand the feedback. 19. A man told the interviewer up front that his references would tell 2 very different sides of the story, depending on which one she contacted first. The interviewer looked up from her notes immediately. He nodded as though this was a responsible and transparent thing to disclose during a first interview. She asked him to elaborate on what he meant by 2 sides. He said he would rather let them speak for themselves, and smiled. The interviewer placed her pen down and did not pick it up again for the remainder of their conversation that afternoon. 20. A man spent the first portion of his interview explaining how deeply passionate he was about the company and everything it stood for. The interviewer was visibly warming to him. Then she asked him a basic follow-up question, and he mispronounced the company name. She gently corrected him. He thanked her, and then mispronounced it again differently the second time around. The room became very quiet. He continued talking about his passion for the organization without acknowledging what had just happened twice in front of the entire hiring panel sitting across from him. 21. A woman was asked during her interview what unique strengths she would bring to the team. She sat up straight and announced that her greatest professional superpower was manifesting outcomes. The interviewer nodded and waited for her to explain what that meant in a practical workplace context. She smiled and said nothing further. The interviewer asked again using slightly different words. She simply nodded confidently, as though the concept was self-explanatory and required no additional detail. The panel moved on uncomfortably. She later told her friends the company lacked the spiritual maturity to appreciate what she was offering them. 22. A man was sitting in his interview going reasonably well until the topic of his previous role came up. The interviewer asked why he had left his last position. He straightened up and explained that a coworker had changed the office Spotify playlist without asking anyone, and the working environment had simply become unbearable after that incident. The interviewer stared at him, waiting for the real reason. He stared back because that was the real reason. He felt it demonstrated his strong stance on workplace boundaries. The offer did not come, and he remains firm on his position to this day. 23. A woman told the interviewer she thrives in fast-paced environments and handles her schedule with real discipline. The interviewer was encouraged and kept listening. Then she mentioned that after every single meeting she attends, she requires a minimum of 3 full decompression days before she can return to productive work. The interviewer looked at the calendar on her desk. The role involved daily meetings with multiple teams across the organization. Nobody said this out loud, but everyone in the room did the same mental calculation at exactly the same moment and arrived at the same conclusion together. 24. A man handed over a resume that described him as a driven self-starter who takes initiative without needing direction. The interviewer was impressed and asked him to give a recent example of something he had started independently. He thought about it for a noticeably long time. Then he admitted that he had not really started anything new since sometime in 2021. The interviewer asked what had been keeping him busy since then. He said he had been in a planning phase. She wrote that down carefully and circled it. The position required someone who could begin projects immediately without extended planning phases. 25. A woman was asked about her relationship with deadlines since the role was heavily time-sensitive. She smiled warmly and said she is absolutely excellent with deadlines. The interviewer looked relieved. Then she added that she works best when deadlines are treated more as a general suggestion rather than a strict requirement. The interviewer read the job description again silently. Every single responsibility listed on the page involved a hard deadline attached to a client deliverable. She smiled back at the woman across the table and wrote 2 words on her notepad that the woman could not see from her side. 26. A teenage boy applying for an entry-level position told the panel confidently that he picks things up extremely fast and can get up to speed in any industry quickly. The interviewer smiled and said that was great to hear. She then asked him a basic question about the industry the company operated in, just to get a sense of his current knowledge. He leaned forward and asked her what industry the company was actually in. The panel went very quiet. He had submitted a tailored cover letter that morning, specifically mentioning his passion for that exact industry by name. 27. A man leaned across the table and told the hiring panel that he was probably the only person at his entire previous company who truly and deeply understood the company mission. He said it with complete sincerity and held eye contact the whole time. The interviewer was curious and asked him to describe what that company actually sold so she could understand the mission better. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. After several seconds, he admitted he was not entirely sure what they sold exactly. The panel nodded slowly and thanked him genuinely for coming in that day. 28. A woman was asked to share her proudest professional achievement during the interview. She thought about it briefly and then announced that her biggest accomplishment was personally convincing her entire apartment building to switch to a different pizza delivery app. She described the campaign she ran, including the group chat messages and the spreadsheet she made comparing delivery times. The interviewer listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When she finished, the interviewer asked if she had any achievements from an actual workplace setting. The woman said this one felt more impactful, and she stood by it completely. 29. A man told the interviewer within the first few minutes that he considers himself a genuine thought leader in his field. He said it with real conviction and seemed to expect the interviewer to agree immediately. She asked him what ideas or insights he had contributed recently that demonstrated that kind of leadership. He paused and mentioned something vague from what he called Q3 without specifying which year or what the idea actually was. The interviewer asked him to expand on it. He changed the subject smoothly and started asking about the office coffee situation instead, which she found genuinely remarkable. 30. A man included competitive eating on his resume under relevant experience and waited for the interviewer to ask about it. She did ask about it. He explained that participating in competitive eating demonstrated his ability to perform consistently under intense time pressure and that it translated directly into professional output. The interviewer looked at the resume and then looked at him for a long moment. He nodded encouragingly. She asked if he had any other examples that were perhaps more traditionally workplace-related. He said competitive eating was actually his strongest one and suggested she give it more serious consideration before dismissing it. Here are points 31 to 40. 31. A woman walked into her interview and within the first 5 minutes announced she has what she personally describes as CEO energy. The interviewer asked her to elaborate on what that meant in practical terms. She explained it means she brings vision and authority to every room she enters. The interviewer nodded and asked how she handles independent decision-making. She thought about it and said she works best when someone tells her exactly what to do and in what order. Nobody pointed out what had just happened. She left believing the interview had gone extremely well and expected a senior-level offer. 32. A man was asked to describe his communication style since the role involved heavy client interaction daily. He leaned back comfortably and said his style could best be described as chaotic but effective. The interviewer asked him to explain what effective looked like in practice. He said people always eventually get the information they need from him. She asked about his email response times specifically. He admitted he does not really respond to emails as a general rule and finds the format quite limiting personally. The interviewer had 3 unanswered emails from him sitting in her inbox from earlier that same morning. 33. A man told the panel he once completely redesigned his entire team's workflow system using only sticky notes and a whiteboard over a single weekend. He described it with the enthusiasm of someone who had solved a genuinely complex problem. The interviewer leaned forward and asked how the team responded to the new system. He paused and then admitted that nobody on the team had actually followed it at any point after he introduced it. The interviewer asked why. He said the team was not ready for that level of operational thinking yet, and seemed completely unbothered by this information. 34. An older woman sat down confidently and told the panel she had 10 full years of experience in the field, which was exactly what the role required. The interviewer was pleased and began asking detailed questions about her background. She answered comfortably for a while, and then casually mentioned that 9 of those 10 years were mostly observational in nature. The interviewer stopped typing. She asked what observational meant in this context. The woman explained she had watched colleagues do the work closely for 9 years, which she felt absolutely counted toward her overall experience total and should not be discounted. 35. A man sat across from the interviewer and said completely unprompted that he believed he was overqualified for the position but was willing to consider it anyway. The interviewer asked what specific qualifications made him feel that way. He picked up his resume and began reading from it slowly. The first skill listed was breathing. The second was existing under moderate stress. The interviewer waited for him to reach something more technical. He did not reach anything more technical. He finished reading and looked up, expecting her to agree that the gap between his abilities and the role was significant. 36. A woman arrived at her interview and told the panel she is one of the most organized people she has ever personally encountered in a professional setting. The interviewer smiled and asked her to walk through how she prepares for important meetings. She began answering confidently and then stopped mid-sentence. She started looking through her bag for her resume, which she needed to reference. The search continued for 4 full minutes, while the panel watched in silence. She eventually found it folded inside a gym shoe at the bottom of the bag and smoothed it out on the table without commenting. 37. A man told the hiring panel with quiet confidence that he has a personal policy of leaving any job that does not align with his personal brand. The interviewer found this interesting and asked him to describe what his personal brand actually was. He thought about it for longer than felt comfortable. Then he described it using 3 words that contradicted each other entirely. The interviewer asked how many jobs he had left for brand-related reasons. He counted quietly and said 6 in the past 4 years. She wrote the number down and underlined it twice without saying anything further to him. 38. A man proudly told the interviewer he holds what he calls a black belt in multitasking and can handle multiple complex responsibilities at the same time without losing focus. The interviewer was interested and began asking her next question. He immediately asked her to stop and repeat the question from the beginning because he had missed the first part. She repeated it. He asked her to repeat it one more time because he was also reading something on his phone. She put her notepad down. He had used the phrase black belt in multitasking 3 minutes earlier with complete sincerity and full eye contact. 39. The young woman was asked how she typically handles conflict within a team since collaboration was central to the role. She smiled very confidently and said her conflict resolution style is that she simply does not do conflict. The interviewer waited for her to add something practical or constructive after that statement. Nothing followed. She continued smiling as though she had just delivered a remarkably mature and professional answer. The interviewer wrote something down and did not ask a follow-up. The woman later described herself in a social media post as someone who protects her peace and lets results speak for themselves. 40. A man told the interviewer he is an avid reader who consumes books constantly to stay sharp and informed in his professional field. The interviewer was genuinely impressed and asked what he had read most recently. He thought about it carefully, and then named a children's book his younger cousin had left at his house the previous weekend. He said it had some surprisingly relevant themes. The interviewer looked at him steadily. He nodded as though this answer was completely reasonable, given the question she had just asked him in a formal professional interview setting about career development. 41. A man leaned back in his chair and told the interviewer that his previous employer simply was not ready for his vision. The interviewer asked him to describe what that vision actually was so she could better understand. He talked for approximately 2 minutes using words like synergy, an ecosystem, and forward momentum without saying anything specific. She asked him to give one concrete example of the vision he was referring to. He said the problem was that concrete examples were exactly what his previous employer had failed to grasp. She nodded and thanked him, and he interpreted that as deep professional respect. 42. A woman told the panel she brings disruptive energy to every team she joins and considers it one of her greatest professional strengths. The interviewer asked her to explain what disruptive energy looks like in a practical day-to-day workplace setting. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. She said it is more of a feeling than something you can describe with specific words. The interviewer asked her to try anyway. She said you just know it when you see it and smiled. The panel wrote identical notes at the same time without coordinating, and none of those notes were positive. 43. A man told the hiring panel with tremendous pride that he had once saved an entire project completely single-handedly when everyone else had given up on it. The interviewer was impressed and asked what the outcome of that project was after he stepped in. He paused noticeably. Then he admitted the project had ultimately been canceled after he saved it. She asked what saving it had actually involved in that case. He said the important thing was that it was saved before it was canceled, which he felt were two completely separate events that should be evaluated independently of each other. 44. A woman arrived at her interview, and before anything else was discussed, she told the panel directly that she is completely allergic to micromanagement in any form. The interviewer made a note and continued. Later in the conversation, she asked how many times per week the manager would formally check in on her progress and whether those check-ins were mandatory or optional, and the interviewer looked at her previous note. She then asked if feedback would be delivered publicly or privately, and how much advance notice she would receive before each one. The interviewer read her original note again and circled it this time. 45. A man was asked the standard question about professional regrets since the interviewer wanted to understand his self-awareness and growth mindset. He sat quietly for a moment, appearing to think carefully. Then he said his single biggest professional regret throughout his entire career is that he has simply always been far too dedicated to his work. The interviewer waited for him to acknowledge what he had just said. He did not acknowledge it. He looked back at her with a completely straight face, as though this was a vulnerable and honest answer that required real courage to share out loud. 46. A man told the interviewer he is an absolute people person who genuinely loves working with others and thrives in collaborative team environments. She smiled and asked what he enjoys most about working alongside other people. He thought about it honestly for a moment and then said the truth is he finds most people quite exhausting to be around for extended periods of time. The interviewer stopped smiling. He added that he means that in the best possible way and laughed lightly. She did not laugh. The role was entirely team-based and involved sitting in an open-plan office with 14 other people every single day. 47. A woman showed up 20 minutes late to her interview and walked in without any visible concern on her face. The interviewer mentioned the time. She waved her hand lightly and explained that she has excellent time management skills and what had just happened should be considered fashionably punctual rather than late. The interviewer looked at the clock and then back at her. She sat down and began talking about how her punctuality and reliability were two of her strongest professional qualities without pausing to let the irony settle in the room. The panel said nothing and simply let her continue speaking. 48. A man sat down across from the interviewer and within minutes told her he would be a great culture fit for the team. She asked why he felt that way. He said because he noticed that everyone in the office looked very busy whenever the manager walked past, and he also pretends to be busy when the boss walks by. So the cultural alignment was already there. The interviewer was not sure whether to be offended on behalf of the company or simply impressed by his honesty. She was mostly just offended. He took her silence as agreement and asked about the benefits package. 49. A man sat down for what was supposed to be a serious interview for a senior position. When asked about long-term career goals, he said his primary objective was to retire comfortably by the age of 35. The interviewer asked what steps he was taking toward that goal. He said he was hoping this role would accelerate the timeline significantly. And then he leaned forward and asked in a completely serious tone whether the office had a designated nap room or any plans to install one in the near future. The interviewer closed her folder. He asked if that question could be included in the offer negotiation. And there you have it, 49 real human beings who walked into job interviews and somehow made it everyone else's problem. If you laughed at least once, you are legally required to hit that like button right now. Subscribe to BrainFumble and turn on notifications because we find this kind of beautiful disaster every single week. Share this with someone who needs a confidence check before their next interview. Now tell us in the comments which one of these 49 legends do you think actually got hired somewhere else afterward?